Good. Okay. Well, I did the raffle, and one of the people that won is not here. So Jay's one of the respondents. Bridget was the other. Let me run it one more time. Let's see. Random.org. Okay, Jay and Luis, you are our respondents.
Hey, Luis.
Sorry, Luis, is this your
so
third
popular.
time? I think this is your third time, Luis. Well, nonetheless.
It's good. I need the veteran support.
Yeah.
I'm like, you know what? I texted Joe earlier and I was like, watch, I'm gonna get it again, and lo and behold.
You know, you didn't originally get it. Bridget got it, but she's, I think she's traveling or something at the moment.
Semantics.
So,
Lo and grin and behold.
Well, maybe Jay should be gracious and go first, given. Oh, well, or maybe Luis.
Yeah, sure. What is there a place you want us to start?
Am I coming through?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Well, I think that three things that we will want to define today are, and I've done this a little bit already, but the idea of commodity fetishism, what's involved in that, the idea of the aura, and then the idea of phantasmagoria, and what are the viewpoints that seem to be expressed by Benjamin and Adorno. I will give you some historical context. This article by Benjamin was the source of a lot of on the part of Adorno. Adorno disagrees wholeheartedly with many of the claims that are being made in this article, and it has to do with this idea of democratization of art, the idea of breaking down the aura as a move towards a way of bringing art and life back together, and that in doing so, because of the way that film is made, film is a technological art. It's made through the intermediation of cameras and cutting and the assemblage of all the editing techniques and filming and recording techniques, that because of that, it clues the viewers into the material conditions under which the artworks are being produced. And Adorno disagrees with that assessment. And even more than that, he disagrees with the idea that the way to have a truly critical art that rehabilitates art and life, art and social praxis. Adorno thinks that Benjamin's description of film as this democratizing medium that makes the average viewer a critical respondent to the film. He thinks that that's all completely misguided, because really what's at work is a move towards mass production of culture, and that mass production of culture lays the groundwork for techniques of persuasion and propaganda that become very problematic in the rise of Nazism and fascism generally. So we're going to want to, at some point, get to what the aura is. It's actually a collection of different kinds of ideas. It's not necessarily the case that it's one specific thing, that there's, a 1 or 2 word definition of what the aura is. But we will want to talk about the aura, phantasmagoria, and how it relates to commodity fetishism and what's involved in the structure of commodity fetishism.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should start with defining commodity fetishism and phantasmagoria, especially because Marx uses the word phantasmagoria.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like a more direct connection, and maybe aura can come after that. Should I just go ahead and kind of offer some definitions, or?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'll support you. I'll jump in, I promise.
Cool. Yeah, so commodity fetishism is the kind of the phenomenon of us perceiving social relationships among things that are not actually people. For instance, when we trade in marketplaces, when economists talk about stocks, and when all of these things that we talk about exchanging, the language we use and the ideas we hold in our heads to conduct these exchanges are constructed in a way where they obscure the labor that actually produced them. They don't, we don't talk about the people who made a thing.
Yeah, one really, it sort of short circuits the laborious argument that Marx sets up, but instead of starting at physical commodities, one really salient way to describe this is to talk about the money commodity.
Art. Yeah, the money.
What is money? This is a question that's not very easy to answer. It seems like it should be really easy to answer, but it's not. What is money?
Essentially, it's something that substitutes for a value, but that value is, of course, abstract in and of itself. So all of it is just an abstraction.
Well, now it is. There's a really good podcast I listened to recently. I don't know if anyone else heard it. Was it This American Life or maybe Radio Lab, talking about the gold standard, and then the gold standard eventually moving on to like what is our current capitalistic, where we could something about printing, the ability to print money and things like that. It was pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So I think one way to get at it, I remember reading like a self-help book when I was in my 20s about how to like save for the future. And one of the ways that the self-help guru who wrote this book tried to contextualize money was to say, to think about money as basically a measure of your life, your power, and your time, right? That what money is an abstract measure of our labor, basically. I mean, you think about how do you get paid? What do you get paid for? You get paid for using your life and your time and your labor in order to produce things. And that the measure of the value of that is really an abstraction from your own ability to produce things, your own ability to change the world through labor, and change the world through labor can just be like totally material. Like you cut down a tree, you chop it up, and you build a house. You have used your labor to transform the world. This is the labor theory of value, that value comes into being through the ways that human beings use their power, the power of labor, to transform the world and create value through that transformation. And that money is just an abstract, quantified way to express that particular power that human beings have. So that's one aspect of the money commodity. Now, there are some other aspects about it which are important that have to do with things like exchange and whatnot. But remember that money is also a commodity. And money, I think with money, you can really see the way that, you think you have a certain amount of money, like it's an object that you own. But that object is really just an abstract quantification of the work that you have performed in your life, right? It's a quantified abstraction of your own life. Go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, all that's true. And also, so the I guess commodity fetishism is the behavior we carry out, and then the object of that behavior we could describe as objects of that behavior we might describe as phantasmagoria. I don't know if that I phrased that the best, but basically for Marx, phantasmagoria are has to do with the commodity form that which we hold in our minds, which differs from the actual commodity. It's this sort of mystical property that we imbue in the sort of mystical, fantastical, made up thing that we imbue the commodity with, that does this, and it has a negative connotation because it's doing this sort of sinister thing of obscuring the production of the thing, or it makes us not notice the labor that went into it.
It treats itself as though it is itself, like it produced itself, to use like Adorno's terms. It's self-producing, or it conveys that it's self-producing, when in fact that is not the case.
Yeah. So Yeah.
Really interesting. It can, of course, it doesn't convey anything because it's either a completely immaterial abstract concept or it's an inanimate object, the commodity, right? If it's money commodity, it's abstract. If it's, a sports car, it's inanimate. So it's not telling us anything. It's not constructing anything. Who's doing the constructing?
We are.
Yeah, exactly. And it's this motion towards self-oppression, really. It's a way that people, by buying into the system, oppress themselves because they just, in order to partake in the market system, you have to agree to this transformation of material reality into these sort of mythical terms, the mythical terms of the power, the status, the prestige of commodities and this sort of thing. I think that the best one word, it's not a complete definition, but a really good synonym for phantasmagoria here is going to be concealment, right? Concealment is the operative feature of phantasmagoria. And what does phantasmagoria conceal? Well, I mean, phantasmagoria has concealment. It also has something like a projection, right? It conceals one thing and projects a different reality, right? Did you guys, I know it was optional, but the readings that are optional are very straightforward to read. They're, I think it might help to contextualize some things. And there's a reading on the history of phantasmagorias generally. Did anybody take a look at that? I only uploaded it a few days ago. It's very short. It's maybe like 6 to 8 pages. And it's interesting because phantasmagoria as a cultural phenomenon is like, I don't know, like an 18th century version of like a haunted house sort of thing. You would walk through these chambers and there would be all sorts of technological wonders that were projecting images of, various horrible things and whatever. But what's really interesting about it is that there's a precursor to the phantasmagoria where, for instance, the actual technological objects, the newfangled technology would just be on display and people would marvel at the technology in its operation. And what's really interesting about the phantasmagoria is that it uses similar sorts of technological production means, but the whole thing is that it hides its sources, so that it hides the cameras, it hides the projection screens. It creates this, fantastical sort of world through technological means, but the characteristic difference is that those means are then hidden. And it's really interesting because the phantasmagoria is this moment where enlightenment, rationality, technology, and myth and horror, they start to align in this really interesting way, because it's this technological wonder, but then it's used in the interests of creating this mythical sort of experience that actually conceals the material production that brings it forth, right? And so it's this interesting sort of pleasure that is one of the ways the writer of that article describes it is it's this weird sort of pleasure where you have the technological rationalized cameras and that sort of thing. So, but then when they're hidden, it's not that you actually believe in the phantasmagoria, but there's something about being in a space where you are enabled to pretend like you believe in the experience. There's a strange sort of, it's not like you really, like when you're watching a movie too, it's the same sort of thing. It's like getting engrossed in the movie doesn't mean that you actually don't know that you're not sitting there or don't know that you're sitting there in the theater. I mean, there's always this sense that, yeah, you are there, but there's something about the freedom to sort of live vicariously through the technology, to experience a reality, even though it's not the way the world really is. It doesn't matter because you have, I suppose, suspended your disbelief or whatever. And so there's this weird sort of pleasure of being fooled, but also knowing that you're being fooled, which is sort of interesting as regards the phantasmagoria Which is sort of interesting when you think about, like commodity fetishism too. I mean, I think that all of us probably have a very strong sense of how commodity fetishism works, about how, the labor principles that underlie commodities, and the idea that commodities are these sort of fake stand-in versions of meaningful experiences of the world. Like, so for instance, when we talk about commodified music, we have a sense of like a real, like deep, profound musical experience. And then we also have an idea of the commodified version of a deep musical experience, that the commodified version is kind of like a fake for a true, profound musical experience. But what's sort of interesting about late capitalism is that even though we know that the commodity market and the way of evaluating life based in commodities, even though we know that that's all an illusion, it still works. It's still really descriptive of the way that we experience the world.
One of the things that Adorno talks about is with capitalism is it kind or well, and I think he thinks that Wagner is kind of contributing to this mentality, but it sets itself up so that even when we recognize it, it can't be gotten rid of.
Yeah, right. It can't be gotten rid of.
It's just it asserts itself as a condition of our discourse, as our, like, it's just the way things are.
Yeah, just the way things are and have to be. And that's related to the naturalism paradigm in representational art. The idea that the artwork is so well constructed that it seems to be self-producing is really an expression of taking a particular way of framing the world, a particular viewpoint on the world, and presenting it as though it's just the way things naturally are and have to be. And it's really interesting. This brings us, I suppose, maybe to Benjamin and what Benjamin has to say about the material production side of film, and whether or not there's any sort of critical potential to the way films are produced that maybe awaken the viewers to the constructedness of film. That's something that Benjamin argues for, that the film, because of the way it cuts into reality, it's defamiliarizing, it's shocking, and that reveals to us the fact that the film that we're watching is a constructed version of reality. But that's an interesting question, because I think that's true of a lot of avant-garde film. But it does occur to me that at least since about 1920 or so, film has become so conventionalized that we don't typically, I think, notice the constructedness of films, at least films that are all about, buster spectacles and that sort of thing. I think that much revealing the production of film, very often the value is like to create a completely immersive experience, so that the viewers are just so totally blown away that they can't even they don't even think of the fact that they're watching the movie. They're just totally engrossed with it. I mean, that certainly is the case with Netflix and binge-worthy TV, right? The whole idea about binge-worthy TV is that you have to set up your plots in such a way that people can't get enough, right? They're just totally absorbed and engrossed in it.
I wonder if the actual, not just the content of films and the aims of film producers and Netflix and studios, they're making the things, not just the way it's constructed, but the actual physical medium has something to do also with the way we don't notice its construction. We don't see the celluloid flickering, we don't see scratches, we don't see there are fewer things reminding us that the camera is mediating our experience. I feel like the film at the time of Benjamin would have had little ruptures that are constantly reminding you that it's not it's not 4K HD.
Yeah, that's definitely true. The idea of high definition as just a way, it's just the nth degree of the naturalism paradigm. You're trying to present a version of reality that has this strange sort of ideality about it, that it even seems more real than reality because it's so much more detailed or clean than reality as we actually experienced it. I mean, it's really interesting with the case of painting, because it does occur to me that with a painting, the materiality is a lot more front and center than with film. Even film in Benjamin's day. It's interesting that Benjamin thinks of film as maybe just as a result of its novelty being the sort of thing that makes us very aware of how it's produced. Maybe the implication is that he takes painting to exist in this social context that we're all very familiar with, or at least, you know, people in his milieu at that time in history were all very familiar with. And so because of the familiarity of the genre of painting, people didn't pay as much attention to the constructiveness of it. I mean, I think that that's something descriptive of how we experience film now, you know, that we're so familiar with the cliches and the tropes and the various ways that filmmakers imply like the passage of time or imply memory or all sorts of various things, you know, in the continuous flow of time through different technical tricks. We're so familiar with those tricks that we don't even register that it's like a constructed version of it. It's just something we're very familiar with. But, you know, one thing that's kind of interesting as regards what Benjamin has to say about film and the power of the Phantasmagoria has to do with this aspect of distraction that he talks about to a certain extent. Because one of the things about Kant's theory of aesthetic experience, which fortunately I don't have time to go through in its entirety, but am I making sense? Are you all there? Oh, good. Okay, because my screen. Okay, one of the things. So I've said with Kant and the conception of aesthetic as a particular power, a particular expression of the freedom that human beings have to experience the world in a particular way. One of the things about is that it requires a certain amount of work on the of human beings to have an aesthetic. You have to experience in a way that you have to experience an object or the world in a way that is a little bit out of the ordinary. Jay, since you were my TA in 303, would you like to summarize some of the aspects about aesthetic experience on the Kantian view and its relationship to more sort of utilitarian ways of engaging with the world?
Yes. So Kant.
People have a sense of what we're talking.
Yeah. So Kant talks a lot. His conception of aesthetics has a lot to do with the distinction between use value and function.
Well, it's about interest, self-interestedness, or yeah.
Yes. And I guess he.
No.
But
I don't know what's going on.
I don't know.
Wait.
Nothing's going on our end.
You're all frozen. Ah. Oh, I don't know.
Should we like all turn our videos off?
Okay.
Will that make your?
Oh, this is annoying. Just start talking, Jay. Just start talking. Oh, maybe I have audio. I don't have video now. Oh, there you're.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So Kantian aesthetics are also. Can I tie in organicism? Is that a valid thing?
Well, the main thing in as regards distraction, the sort of distracted experience of being in a movie that holds your hand and you know, has a really riveting story and whatever, versus the sort of rapt attention that's required when you're consciously choosing to engage with an object aesthetically.
Right.
So the main aspects from Kantian aesthetics to bring into this is the idea of disinterestedness and Zweckmäßigkeit ohne Zweck, which I can type in here in the chat. But two things, disinterestedness, I think I spelled that right, and
So
purposivity without
purposeless purposefulness.
Yeah, it's technically purposivity. Oh, purposivity without purpose. It didn't. It auto corrected purposivity to purposively.
Yeah.
But
well, which does, I mean, this does tie into kind of use value versus intrinsic value.
Yeah.
Where it having an aesthetic experience, for the highest form of that for Kant, is one where you lend all of this attention to a thing without, but not for its use, not for its function.
Yeah, to experience something aesthetically on Kant's account is an experience in which the thing engages your rational cognitive faculties of reflection, but it does so in a way that doesn't produce a general concept. Okay, that's a bunch of stuff that is hard to understand, but basically what he's saying is that when you experience something aesthetically, it seems to hang together in a way that makes sense, like there's a purpose to it. But the actual act of experiencing it aesthetically doesn't have a purpose. So if I experience a tree aesthetically, I'm experiencing it as beautiful, and it's beautiful because it's the sort of thing that hangs together in a way that seems like it's designed, almost as though the world is designed for me. It feels like the world makes sense. There's a sort of way that the world hangs together logically that I experience as beautiful. But in experiencing it as beautiful, it's only beautiful to the extent that it's not, it doesn't hang together in the interest of some external purpose. If I tree as hanging together in a particular way because I see that there are branches growing out of it and I can chop those branches down and burn them to stay warm or turn them into a house or whatever, that's not an aesthetic experience. That is an experience of the tree in terms of a purpose that's external to the tree, right? The purpose of keeping myself warm, using the tree as an object, as a thing. But to experience it as beautiful is to experience it as having this sort of very difficult to describe purposivity to it, this sense that it does have a purpose, and yet there's no external purpose that I can identify. And the purposivity is a function of the way it is constructed or the way it hangs together in such a way that it seems to make sense. It seems designed in a really logical, beautiful way. But it doesn't have a purpose. And also related to that is this idea that in order to experience a thing as beautiful, I have to experience it on its own terms, as beautiful for its own sake, and not because it might give me, material pleasure, like I could eat an apple or I could cut down a tree and turn it into a house. Those are all ways of experiencing the tree that are in my own interest. But to experience something beautifully, according to Kant, is to experience it without any of that sort of self-interest, just to experience it as beautiful on its own terms. Okay. The thing about this sort of experience is that most of the time when we're in the world, we don't experience the world this way. We experience the world as being the sort of thing that we need to manipulate in order to survive as organisms or in order to make our lives more efficient or whatever. And it takes a certain amount of work and patience and reflectiveness in order to experience a thing aesthetically. And this sort of work that's involved in aesthetic experience is quite different from what Benjamin and I think Adorno as well describe as that sort of state of distractedness when you're watching a movie that doesn't require any particular cognitive input from you.
Or for Adorno watching a Wagner opera.
Or yeah, watching a Wagner opera. Yeah, exactly. But this idea of just being swept up in the rapturous spectacle of an artwork is not aesthetic from a Kantian point of view, because Kant's aesthetics require a certain sort of discipline and patience and reflection. And also, I'd say getting swept up in spectacle is going to be, for Kant, I would say, a self-interested move, right? Because you're interested in having this sort of rapturous physical pleasure, perhaps, you know, the way that it titillates your amygdala, or you know, maybe it makes you race or whatever. This sort of experience is not aesthetic for Kant. That's just, you know, sort of self-interested. And so, you know, the thing with film and with film versus painting is that I think because painting maybe is less of a spectacle, it's less distracting than a film. It requires more work to get into the aesthetic experience with a painting. And this is why I kind of disagree with this formulation as Benjamin puts it, but Benjamin says that when we say experience a painting, when we work hard to experience something aesthetically, how does he say it? He says we're absorbed in the experience, we're absorbed in the object. But in the case of distraction, the film is, let's see, is absorbed into us. I think that's the way he says it. And for me, it's really quite the opposite experience. I mean, the whole idea of working hard to have an aesthetic experience always is combined with this sense of distance. Like, I would like to get into the full experience of an artwork, but if I have to work in order to have an aesthetic experience, there's always going to be this sort of like rupture in my full immersion in the experience. Whereas in the case of distraction, like being in a video game or in a movie on this account, it's much more like I'm completely immersed in the experience, such that my cognitive and rational and critical faculties are suspended. Like, I abdicate that sort of experience of knowing that I'm there working hard to have an experience of a thing.
Is there a contradiction then in Benjamin when he talks about aura and distance and also advocates film stuff? Well, I guess.
Well, yeah. Unpack that. Why would there be a contradiction?
Well, if for Benjamin, aura can only be perceived from that sort of removed distance that you just described. Mm-hmm. Like, for having an aesthetic experience, in Kantian terms at least, we need a sort of rupture between ourselves and the thing. We can't be fully immersed and swept away. And that kind of aligns with the way Benjamin defines aura, or the example.
It does. But the thing is, Benjamin thinks that film represents a breakdown of the aura.
Okay, then it does. There's not a contradiction.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's hard to get that sense very clearly from the way he writes it. And I think it's because he sees the breakdown of the aura as being kind of melancholy. He has a melancholy about it. You know, that there's a sense of loss in the breakdown of the aura, but that it's like maybe a necessary step in order to make art political, in order to, you know, democratize art and to awaken the critical faculties of the masses and this sort of thing. He thinks it's like a necessary sacrifice that has to be made, I think. Yeah. And it's sort of interesting. I mean, I think that Adorno also has a lot of, I suppose, anxiety about the concept of the aura and the concept of, he calls it phantasmagoria, but this sort of sense of this special sort of aesthetic realm of experience. I think he also sees it as basically a bad thing, but also is something that, you know, he would not be completely celebratory in the, you know, the complete dismantling or the complete disappearance of auratic aesthetic experience. That there's a sort of sense of loss that has to be registered whenever you critique the aura, because it's also this sort of special thing. And I think if we get outside of Adorno's and Benjamin's terminology here, I think that we can probably identify something similar in our own lives as regards art, and whether or not it's like this special domain of experience, which is really sort of, you know, I don't know, maybe an expression of freedom, or just a very sort of special way of being in the world, with the problem that as artists, we often encounter the fact that we don't, it's very hard to influence society through our arts, to make political art, you know, to make art that addresses or even solves the problems of our society, say economic inequality or racism or these sorts of things. It's sort of hard to, certainly it's hard to have both, right? Art as this sort of special sphere of maybe like some sort of pure freedom, purely free activity, because it's not about fulfilling my own self-interests or whatever, or it's not even about anything at all. It's just pure, I don't know, enjoyment or pure content or something like that, pure form, whatever. And the feeling that art is sort of outside society and is impotent, that it, you know, especially when our society is going to hell, it certainly can feel sort of decadent and elitist and just like a waste of time to be producing art that doesn't try to address the problems of the world. So this is really the tension that's at the heart of these writings.
Maybe Heidegger's, we already talked about Heidegger's take on art, and that's sort of useful, like, or kind of a salve for what you're saying, where like art is kind of the light by which other things are brought into the world or brought to presence.
Yeah,
that seems a little more.
Give me
his conception.
Give me a nice concrete game plan for what we need to do as artists to ameliorate that problem.
Yeah,
you know, it's hard. It's tricky.
Well, I guess I'm just. It seems like Heidegger has a more realistic understanding of the role that art has and can be expected to play in society, where we're like, we don't expect, like a light bulb doesn't make the physical things in the room what they are, but it shows us what they are.
It reveals them, yeah.
Or art's job is not to create.
I understand that.
Racial equality.
I understand. Yeah, no, I know. I understand that. But then at the end of the day, that seems to just be a form of resignation to the question of art's impotence in society, right? I mean, it's sort of like, yeah, all it does is, there's the question of impotence, like, yeah, okay, it reveals how we see the world, and maybe that's good. But then there's also the problem of the mere revealing of worlds is not itself normative. There's nothing ethical about that. It's just revealing what's important to us. It's revealing how we see the world and how we evaluate the world. But it has nothing to say about how we should evaluate the world, or the world that we would want to make, you know. It's in some sense just descriptive and not, it doesn't have that ethical normativity that seems to be the sort of thing that we would want, the normativity that would enable us to imagine a new sort of more just, more free world and work to create it. You know, there's something about Heidegger which is a little bit too resigned, I think. Although I agree that, you know, it's probably impossible to achieve that sort of, I don't know, maybe even call it utopian vision or something. But still, the fact that it's impossible doesn't mean that we shouldn't long for it. You know, it's this. This is the thing you get with Adorno very clearly. Like, I think Adorno has this longing for some sort of like utopia, but also believes it's impossible, right? And believes we shouldn't actually try to manifest it in the world. But still there's this sense of wanting it to be possible. You know?
There's that line in the Pirkei Avot in the Jewish writings of the ancestors that that says it's not for you to complete the work, but neither are you free to whatever deter from it.
Yeah, you know, and so like, you know, this kind of describes my way of my experience of like, spirituality or something. It's like, I'm basically an atheist, but I wish I weren't, you know? And there's some value in having that space of possibility, even though it's impossible. Just not totally foreclosing a thing because even trying to instantiate it in material reality would be disastrous. You know, whenever you try to instantiate a utopia, at least the versions of utopia we've seen in the last 100 years or so, where they've tried to instantiate them materially, it's been completely dehumanizing, catastrophe. Still, this idea, this feeling of a longing for, a utopian future is hard to lay to rest. I think you just have to use that sort of longing as a way to critique existing forms of government and social oppression, and not as a positive formulation for a society that is built through coercion or something like that. Yeah. And there was one other thing that I wanted to bring up, and now it's sort of flitted out of my mind. But yeah, I think that, and I think that maybe one of the problems with Benjamin's writing here is that Benjamin only became a Marxist, or only got interested in Marxism in the last 10 years of his life or so. And before that, most of his work was highly informed by Jewish mysticism and this sort of messianic idea of, some sort of messianic utopia as something that is outside of the material world as we find ourselves in it, but it's the sort of thing that could nonetheless be hoped for, or be an ideal, or the sort of thing that makes our lives meaningful. And it seems that with this idea of the democratization of art, rupturing the aura through a democratized medium like film, such that the average film viewer now becomes a critic, then maybe there's something a little bit heavy-handed or kind of hackneyed about it. It's a move to try to immanentize the eschaton, as people used to say in the 60s, to make utopia real in material reality, and it's basically going to fail. But for me, with Benjamin in this work, this idea of film's democratization of aesthetic experience feels a little too, I don't know. I just want to be led along a little bit more, in the utopian dream. There's something maybe a little too, or I don't know, naive and I suppose I don't know, materialistic about the sort of utopian aspect to Benjamin's article. I was going to say, this is also something that connects us back to Plato, because one of the things in the Republic is that Plato is creating this theory for a utopian society. And there's a part in the Republic where one of Socrates' interlocutors says, yeah, all sounds very good, but of course, it's impossible. This will never actually be the sort of thing that we could instantiate in physical reality, right? It's this ideal. And Socrates is happy with that. He thinks that, yes, of course, the perfect society is a utopian Platonic ideal that can't ever actually be manifested in the world of appearance, in the physical world. What Plato then does is to take the fact that the ideal society can't be manifested in this world. He takes that then to mean that this world is a problem, that this world is false, that this world is somehow degraded or whatever. And we don't necessarily need to follow Plato in that regard, but I think it's really interesting to look at theories of utopia before the 20th century. I think that Plato and then Sir Thomas More, who actually coined the word utopia in a book of the same name, Utopia. In both cases, one of the characteristics of their utopias is that they were impossible. They were the sort of things that couldn't actually be manifested in reality because of how ideal they were. And so then it's interesting when you look at the versions of utopia, say fascism and Stalinism or whatever in the 20th century, that actually want to make utopia material. That maybe one of the reasons that they become so catastrophic is because that can never actually happen. This idea, when I said immanentizing the eschaton, I'll just immanentizing the eschaton. You know what the eschaton is? If we talk about an eschatological theory, or an the eschaton is the end. If you like the book of Revelation in the Bible, there's the book of Revelation, and there's all the stuff, dragons and whatever, disease and whatever happens. And then at the end, there's eternity of reconciliation between God and the world, where the world becomes redeemed and becomes unified with God. And that's eschaton. It's a utopian unity of God and man, God and the world, the spirit and the world in Hegelian terms. And it's this sort of thing that is not material, right? It's like, well, maybe it is. I mean, in the biblical, I think at the end of the book of Revelations, the idea is that earth comes restored or something, like it's no longer fallen. And so it is actually material reality, but it's material reality that's no longer fallen or something like that. But this idea of trying to make that utopian ideal real in real material socio-political reality is sometimes referred to as immanentizing the eschaton, making the eschaton immanent in the world, not this side the world in the realm of Platonic forms or whatever, but utopia really physically, truly here in the here and now. And it's proved disastrous over the last 100 years or so as people have tried to do that. But it seems like that's kind of the move, or at least a step in that direction, is what Benjamin is engaged in here in this essay, because he's trying to find this way of bringing art and life back together, art and social praxis back together. It's a way of breaking down the aura, that strange sort of otherworldly separation of the aesthetic realm and, socio-political and material reality. And he thinks that film might be a way of breaking that, or bridging that gap, or breaking down that boundary. But of course, then Adorno comes along and says, look, it looked like it was so promising, but it turns out that the culture industry just co-opted film as a medium and mass art as a phenomenon and uses it to its own ends, which takes the form of propaganda. So mass art as a form of propaganda. And it's interesting that one of the engines of propaganda is the concealing of the apparatus by which a message is transmitted or a message is conveyed, and so this motion away from what Benjamin's talking about, how the camera makes us aware of the production, the underlying labor and constructedness of the artwork, because through the standardization of the Hollywood studio system in the 40s and 50s and into the various sorts of blockbuster films, after that, there is this sort of standardization where the productive aspect of film, again, sort of becomes invisible, and we only pay attention to the content, the stories, the characters, the feeling of titillation when we see an explosion or whatever, and so it's a way of, once again, removing or concealing the apparatus of production and all the ideology that's bound up with the way that films are produced. It's a way of concealing that again.
Is Adorno's problem with integral serialism the same as his problem with utopian systems that conceal the construction?
Maybe. It doesn't occur to me that he thinks that the constructedness of the serial system is invisible. I think he thinks that that's probably pretty clear. I think for him it's more, so for him, what's important about serialism is the way that it elevates means over ends, right? So just in the way, like if you ever, has anybody ever like actually taken classes in a business school before? I'm just curious. Nobody's ever taken a management course? Okay, I have. I took a finance course once. One of the things that you see very clearly in the way that sort of education is carried out is that all of the focus is on how to be an efficient manager and not what a good sort of thing is to manage, right? And so what we see there is an elevation of means, efficiency, the best, most effective way to do something, versus ends, which is what is a good thing to do, right? One of the things about ethics is that, at least traditionally, it arises out of the use of reason to discover what good ends are. So like the end of human activity is an ethical world, for instance, right? That's an end. But if we're focused on means, then we're only focused on the way that we carry out an activity, perhaps most efficiently, or in a most rationalized way. And we're not terribly concerned about whether it's a good activity to do or a bad activity, right? And I think that that is at the heart of Adorno's critique of serialism as well, the way that in serialism, all of the emphasis is on the system, on the rationalized, quantified aspects of the system, and not on what a good work of art might be, or what a good sort of true expression of one's experience of the world, or this sort of thing, right?
But then wouldn't he have a problem with just any art? Because all art works within a system. And in some ways,
Yeah.
in some ways, like there's a varying level degree of whether or not the means to the end is more or less, than serialism. I think I have a problem with that.
Well, I would say there are a few possible responses to that. One would be that it's really only until something like the 17th or 18th century that we have this idea of art as being autonomous, that before the 18th century, all art was created towards some other end. And quite often it would be a religious or spiritual, sometimes ethical. I mean, in the case of the Republic, the whole idea of poetry being good or bad is because of the end that it seeks on an ethical level, right? What sort of values is it encouraging, and what sorts of behavior is it producing in the people that engage with the art, right? And so that is an example of how art might be the technical apparatus of art is subordinated to some, perhaps quote unquote higher end, an ethical end, right? I think as regards serialism versus other forms of modern art, I think that Adorno is really, very, very congratulatory about non-systematic art. I think for him, the main problem is the sort of apotheosis of the system in serialism, that he thinks that there's something kind of dehumanizing about that. And it's because expression doesn't even enter the picture. Whether or not a piece of music is expressive is irrelevant. What's important is the systematic construction of the piece. And I think, I was, last week, I should just get up the quote here now, but I think I can probably remember it. Last week, I was reading this quote of Adorno to you, which was kind of interesting, talking about the breakdown of the ara. He talked about it in terms of the German word Schein. I guess I should probably write this word here for you. Schein is a word that has a storied history in German aesthetics. I know at least it goes back as far as Hegel. I'm not sure before Hegel who might have been using it, but at least since Hegel, the word Schein is an important term associated with aesthetic experience. Schein has a twofold meaning. It means both to seem like something, like if I say that seems good to me, I would say das scheint mir gut zu sein. It has the appearance of being good. That's shine. But shine also has the meaning of radiance. So like a halo in German, an angel's halo is a Heiligenschein. It's this radiation. So it's like to shine. It's related to the English word shine, right? So it has this dual meaning of something being like this sort of like halo-like aura around an art object, but also it's the seeming, the appearance of the object, right? And so it's this dual thing where it's like through seeming, through representation, it transforms the world of appearance as we see it into something special, mystical, spiritual, or something like that. That's what shine is. And so if you remember from the writing last week, Adorno was saying that, there's this idea of the semblance, the way that an artwork takes all of the fragmentation of the world and through the aesthetic aura unifies the fragmented material of reality. But then what he says is, what happens when, instead of having an artwork that is totally unified in this way, it's maybe like a cubist painting where there are a bunch of parts that don't fit together in any logical, unified or organic way, or maybe there's actual reality that is placed into the artwork such that the special sort of spiritual sphere of the artwork breaks down, because bits and pieces of newspapers or whatever, the real physical world is now in the artwork. And he says that shine disintegrates. And then he says two further things. And last time I focused on the very end of the sentence where he says that when you insert reality, like in 4 minutes, 33 seconds, insert reality into the artwork, it transforms reality into aesthetic effect. That's the very end of that sentence. And I was saying how like one aspect of that is you look at 4 minutes, 33 seconds, and the material 4 minutes, 33 seconds is the sound of the real material world, but it transforms it into something that's not material anymore. It makes it aesthetic. But the one part of that sentence that I didn't talk about was right before that. He says, thus acknowledging the break and transforming that break into aesthetic effect. Okay, so the whole idea is this. We've got situation A, the default situation of romantic art. An artwork takes the fragmented chaos of reality and transforms it into something meaningful and unified and organized as a way of healing the break of the disunity of the world as we experience it. In modern art, we have a situation where that breaks down because either the work is not unified anymore or there's reality that's plugged into the artwork. And then what happens is that because of that act of aestheticizing reality, material reality, in a broken way, because it's not a unified artwork, it acknowledges the break between art and reality and transforms it into aesthetic effect. And so what he's saying is that in good modernist art, according to Adorno, a good modernist artwork will take the sort of brokenness of modernity, the fragmentation, the fact that we feel like maybe we're not part of community, or in the division of labor, right? The way that our labor no longer feels like a meaningful activity to us, but instead we're just in a cubicle typing at a computer, or we're in a factory pulling a lever, or even in classical music, we have the division of labor, the fact that performance and composition are two separate activities that are performed by professionals, right? That's all divided labor. That's all the fragmentation of modernity, right? And so good modernist art will take that fragmented aspect of reality and aestheticize it, but aestheticize it in a way that doesn't give us the lie of a happy ending, a happy unity. Because romantic art is always a happy ending in some sense. Because of its unified organic character, it is a way to unify humans with the world once again. But Adorno thinks that modernist art, because it's not unified, it still reflects that fragmentation, but it doesn't put it in a situation that's a happy ending. It just acknowledges the break, it acknowledges the fragmentation and the break between art and life as just the way the world is, but registers something kind of tragic about that, right? That break itself is made part of the work instead of just being swept under the rug in the interests of organic unity, right? And so, this is related to what I was saying, where, this idea of not trying to materially manifest a utopia, but still having it be the sort of thing that is like an ideal that can never be reached, right? That there's a sort of maybe tragic kind of melancholy to that. And that's the sort of thing that a modernist artwork, according to Adorno, a good modernist artwork will do. It will acknowledge the fact that utopia is impossible as part of the aesthetic experience of the artwork. Yeah. So, it's it's a very intricate dialectical way of reading the social relationship of art and political economy and so on. But it's this idea that the culture industry, a rom-com, gives us a spurious kind of unity. It teaches us that everything's okay, right? It takes the fragmented experience of the world, the fact we can't find love or someone who understands us or whatever, and what it does through the techniques of a happy ending, just turn it into a sort of spurious unity where we, through the film, we vicariously attain unity with the broken world. But what a modernist artwork will do will acknowledge the fact that we can't find love or people that understand us or other sorts of unity in our life, and it simply acknowledges that fact. But it does so in a way that is also kind of beautiful and tragic and melancholy, because it registers the fact that even though we want it, we want to believe even though we don't believe, right? This sort of thing where it's like we want to believe that unity is possible even though we know it's impossible, is the sort of thing that is captured in this way that a modernist artwork transforms the rupture of art and life into aesthetic effect without giving us the fake happy ending of unity. Make sense? Yeah. So this is I think that that's the closest that Adorno can come to a sort of Platonic ideal. It's a Platonic ideal that is known to be impossible. But the fact that an ideal is impossible doesn't make it useless or valueless or unimportant. I mean, it's still the sort of thing that we can keep in our minds, maybe as a critical tool. You can critique the existing forms of society relative to some more just or free ideal without trying to actually make the ideal manifest in reality. Jay, do you want to, I saw you unmute your microphone at one point.
I was going to say that makes his issue with Wagner a little clearer, I think. Yeah. Just like when I think about the kinds of stories in the Wagner operas, or I was particularly thinking of the ending of Meistersinger, where like the old ways like come out and the guild does the thing, and then they all sing about German nationalism and praise the motherland. And and it's all sunny.
Right. I mean, I think that the Nibelung, even though he's very harsh on the Nibelung in this book, I only gave you one chapter of the book, In Search of Wagner, but the Nibelung is kind of an interesting case because Wotan basically chooses to just let Valhalla, disappear, basically, to disintegrate, rather than try to attain some sort of spurious unity. And so there's a sort of I don't know, interesting tragic element to the Ring that I think Adorno would be more approving of. And in fact, it turns out that in the 60s, he wrote a few articles in response to this book, In Search of Wagner, that was a little bit more, a little bit less harsh about Wagner, that actually was a little bit more celebratory about some of the things that Wagner did. He did the same sort of thing with serialism. There's an article called Vers und Musik informelle, towards an informal music, where he has this sort of rapprochement with serialism, where he says, well, actually, there's a lot of really interesting stuff that came out of the serial movement that, the pieces are really very, it's very hard to predict the sorts of expressions that come out of serialism, that there is a sort of oh, I don't know. And there's also a very critical aspect to serialism, the fact that it's atonal, right? I mean, one of the things about dissonance and unity is that dissonance by its very nature is an affront to unity. This is why until Schoenberg really, or at least until Romanticism, dissonance always has to be resolved, right? In order to have a unified artwork, at least in, you know, Western classical music, dissonances have to first resolve to consonances. If you leave a dissonance unresolved, it's like a hiccup in the unity of the piece, right? There's this aspect in the piece that is in tension with the idea of this all-encompassing unity. And so it's interesting that serialism, if Adorno's original critique about serialism as being dehumanizing because it's so systematic, if that were really apt, then it would seem more apt if serialism were both systematized and also entirely consonant throughout. You know, it's interesting that serialism is dissonant, right? Serial music is all about dissonance as well as systematization, right? And so there's this aspect in serialism that is not totally captured by his original critique of serialism as just the sort of thing that raises systematic writing and thinking to some sort of divine level. There's also this sort of this thorniness to serialism in its use of dissonance that later on he comes to see as having expressive potential in the way that it resists unity. Yeah, there's a lot of other good stuff to draw out of that, but I would say maybe just one more thing about the aura and Phantasmagoria. We've already said this about Phantasmagoria, but also as regards the aura is to art what fetishism is to commodities. Because the aura, just like the fetishism of commodities, conceals the labor that went into the commodity, and it also creates this sort of mythic power in the way that, you know, commodities seem to be the sorts of things that give us prestige, or they're the sort of things around which we construct our identities and these sorts of things. Just as they have that sort of mythic power, the same could be said of art objects. And so the aura, to the extent that we experience a work of art aesthetically in terms of the aura, we're experiencing it without coming into contact with the relations of labor that produced it. And we're also abdicating our own power as agents that experience a thing aesthetically. We are attributing that to the art object as having some sort of mythic power before which we sort of cower in some sort of abject fear and awe or something like that. So, you know, the aura is really pretty much just the idea of commodity fetishism transposed into aesthetic experience. And I think that Phantasmagoria is pretty much the same sort of thing, except that the aura, in the case of, say, traditional art, is very closely tied with spiritual rituals and this sort of thing. And it's not about mass production, right? It's about having a very special sort of object that you can encounter that most people don't have the opportunity to encounter. That's one of the things that enables that sort of experience of the aura, how rare it is. And Phantasmagoria is the sort of thing, if you were able to take Phantasmagoria and instead of, basically what Benjamin is arguing is that because of mass production of films, the aura breaks down. What Adorno is saying is that in mass production, the culture industry and so on, the aura is still there, but it's now turned into Phantasmagoria as this vehicle for ideology, for concealment of the production and the ideological viewpoints that undergird works of art, films, you know, pop music and so on. Yeah.
I was gonna ask, like, how does this relate to, like, I think, was it Heidegger that was talking about like the light that like shines from artwork? Is it in a way is aura sort of similar to this concept?
Well, I
would you
have to
say-
go back and look at the German in that article. I was reading that in German and English when we were going over it, but now I don't.
Because they kind of make like a similar like talk.
Yeah,
of, like,
I mean, Heidegger
talk about
talks
like the original work has this.
Right. Heidegger talks about truth in art as this shining forth which reveals the world to us, right? The thing that I would have to check is if he uses shine, or if he uses some other German word, or if he has some sort of neologism that is derived from the word shine, because one of the things Heidegger does is play around with words, and by putting them in a different, part of speech, turning a verb into a noun or into an adjective or whatever, it enables him to supply a completely idiosyncratic definition to it. So I'm not sure if he's tapping into this tradition of using shine in the way that Hegel and Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and all these people use it. I have a sense that he probably is, because the theory of revealing a world to us through this shining forth of the material reality of the artwork is very much related to this idea of shine. But I would just have to check to see if he's doing something special with that word. But the thing about aletheia is that he really thinks that it's not exactly a different kind of truth from saying something's true or false in a cognitive sense. He thinks that aletheia is just more primordial than the normal way we think of truth. Like, in order to say something's true or false, we first have to have some idea of something that exists, and then the ability to make a statement about that thing that exists, right? There's a thing in the world, you make a statement about it. Your statement either corresponds or it doesn't, right? That's what truth is. That's the structure of truth. What Heidegger thinks is that what art does is something even more primordial than that, because art enables the things that we predicate truth or falsity of, it enables them to show forth at all. The very fact that we have the ability to see a thing as a thing and then predicate truth of it is predicated on this idea that the thing appears to us as it appears at all. Does that make sense? I mean, you have the idea that 1 + 1 = 2 is true. But before you have the ability to say 1 + 1 = 2, you have to have some way in which reality appears to you in terms of numbers like 1 and 2 and operations like 1 and concepts like equality, right? How do those things show up to you in the way they show up to you? That's what aletheia is doing. It's enabling the world to show up to you in a certain way such that you can predicate truth of it. Does that make sense?
Basically giving axioms to truth.
Yeah, basically. I mean, yeah, so we say, Aristotle says A = A is one of the fundamental laws of logic that's indispensable, but how is it that we already have concepts like A and equals, right? So you think about this is related to this idea that for Heidegger, we're already engaged in the world and our activity before we have a concept of our world, right? The concept that when we turn the world as we engage with it as organisms or whatever, just through physically interacting with our world in a very skillful way. From that, we then abstract concepts like identity or things like addition or sameness, difference, these sorts of things. But those are all predicated on the fact that we're already in the world. Right? The axioms of logic aren't primary. What's primary is that we're already in the world even before we even know what logic is. Right? And so that's why aletheia, it's totally related to this idea of logic as being like a kind of derivative and kind of watered down or, just impoverished version of the actual experience of being in the world. Because concepts that we have of the world are abstractions from the richness of actual experience. Right. And what an artwork does is, in a way, it uses objects that we see as a certain thing abstractly as individual objects, but then through the shining or the aletheia, it also, I suppose, contextualizes these objects in a really rich framework of expression, right? A really rich framework of, I don't know, some sort of aesthetic experience. that connects us back to the life world that these concepts emerge from. Yeah. Good. Any last questions? You know, I would recommend reading the Star Wars and the Phantasmagoria articles, because the Star Wars one is a bit long, but it's pretty fun. It's not as hard as, I wanted to give you the you know, the unfiltered articles that a lot of secondary literature is based on, the Benjamin and the Adorno and the Marx. Those are all, you know, primary literature that spawn, you know, lots and lots of other literature, including the Star Wars article. But the Star Wars article is a lot easier to read and a lot more fun, I think. And it's also, I don't know how well you guys know Wagner, but I'm sure like the references and the analyses in the Star Wars article, like I didn't have to go on YouTube and listen. I like have seen these movies so many times that I can just recreate them in my mind while I'm reading the analysis. But you know, now that we've kind of fleshed out what some of these ideas are, go and read the Star Wars article and the Phantasmagoria article, and I think you'll see the way that they're connected to things that we know really well from our daily lives. Okay. All right, I will see most of you next week. And Darren, we can meet now. Sound good? Okay. Let me just turn on.
Take care, bye.
Yeah, see you later. I'm gonna turn on the light here once more.
Yeah, you're getting, I don't know if you want to stop the recording.
Oh yeah, I can do that, it's fine.